Well, what I tell people when I talk about the Great Hanging, which is still a very sensitive subject to a lot of folks, is you have to understand that the people in Cook County or anywhere on the northern Texas frontier in 1862 were living in a pressure cooker. First of all, there were Indians. There will be Indian attacks into Cook County 10 years after the Civil War. The people commonly call the full moon the Comanche moon, right? That's when they came. Small Indian raids sometimes. They never killed more than, say, 5 or 7 people, but that's kind of disingenuous to say, isn't it? What if it was 5 or 7 people you knew? What if it was 5 or 7 of your relatives? Or worse yet, what if it was your family? These had an impact. It was terrifying. Remember, there's no police at all. There's one sheriff, no deputies. There's no legal system. There's no standing police, military force to protect you. They show up, you're on your own. It's up to you. And this is the image of the northern frontier of Texas by 1861, again in Northern newspapers. Apparently we're all hiding behind our houses while the Indians have war dances in our front yards. I'm sure there were some North Texans who probably thought that's about the way it was. Cook County being no exception. So you worried about Indians. What if somebody then came to you and said, you know, there's men amongst us who are conspiring with the Indian groups, the Indian territory, to facilitate an Indian invasion and a raid on our homes? Might you believe them? Right. Were you willing to take the chance that they were lying? Maybe not. Second thing, you lived uncomfortably close to Kansas. Now, the U.S. government, Congress in the mid-1850s, in its infinite wisdom, chose to let the people decide on slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. Congress didn't want to pull the trigger on it. This is the way I portrayed it in my classes. So they passed the buck. Let's let people vote. Now, there's a long-standing U.S. tradition that we don't like to think about. One way to win an election is how? Kill everybody that will vote against you. Works every time, doesn't it? Well, that's not true. There are dead people who vote. We know that here in Texas. Trying to stay away from modern politics, I'm sorry. This was Texans' image of Kansas. When they said, okay, Kansas, you can vote on slavery in its various guises and various arguments over constitutions and Kansas governments, there was a lot of violence. People came in from Missouri and Kentucky, border ruffians, remember. There was open warfare at places like Lawrence, Kansas. I always laughingly tell my students there were 6,000 ballots cast in the first referendum in Kansas on slavery. The bad thing was there were only about 1,600 registered voters in Kansas. So this is Texans' vision of how the slavery debate had become something incredibly dangerous and violent. To them, to Texans, yeah, they know about the Dred Scott decision. Yes, they've heard the debates in Congress, but they've also heard about the killings in Kansas. Hundreds of people being killed in Kansas. It's a civil war up there. And how far is that from Texas? Not far at all. Again, if somebody comes to you and says, I have evidence that men here among us have communication with these ruffians, with these slavery advocates in Kansas who are willing to kill over the issues. I'm going to bring them down here. Would you be willing to risk that happening? Or would you want to take direct action? So, they live in an area where Indian raids are common. They live in an area uncomfortably close to the fighting, literal fighting over slavery, bleeding Kansas. And then, of course, all Southerners live with the fear of a slave uprising. There's a wonderful picture that's off the Library of Congress website. I always love to tell my students about this picture. This is Dallas County in 1912. Tell me the Civil War changed our lives. That looks awful lot like Annabelle, Texas, doesn't it? Except maybe the guys got nicer clothes. Slavery was coming to Texas. In fact, slavery had arrived in Texas. High percentage of slaves in East Texas. Were there slaves in Cook County? Yes. Cook County had a total population of about 3,800 people in 1860. and growing faster all the time, which is another factor. There's a lot of new faces in town. How many slaves? About 10%, 370 or so. But that's growing all the time too. Probably the largest slaveholder in the county was a fellow named William C. Young. We'll meet him again. He had 52. Second largest was James G. Borland with 25. So if you're doing the math real quick, you're thinking, wow, those guys owned over 20% of the slaves in Cook County. There's not a lot of people in Cook County who own slaves. No, they don't. But slaves are there. Slaveholders dominate the economy and the politics. And one of their greatest concerns is a slave uprising. What happens if the slaves rebel? What happens if somebody gives them guns, urges them to rebel, like some of these Kansas zealots? It's an idea. So again, if somebody comes to you and says, I have proof positive, or I believe, that I have agents amongst us who are inciting Indians to attack us, who are connected with those ruffians, those border ruffians in Kansas, who are talking to the slaves about rebelling, are you willing to take a chance? Or if you're faced with this, what will you do about it? You're a pressure cooker. Now, sometimes people talk about, well, you know, John Brown, that was a long way away. And we use that as the standard thing in the U.S. survey course. We say this is the trigger that got many Southerners on the verge of fighting mad about slavery. But that's way off in Virginia, later West Virginia. That's Harper's Ferry. Texans are very well aware of John Brown. They read their newspapers too. But like many Southerners, Texans also read in their newspapers, rightly or wrongly, that Brown wasn't alone, that there were other agents as yet unfound. So in North Texas, after Brown's abortive raid and his execution in late 1859, early 1860, Texans are reading each other's mail. They're going down to local stores and checking to see if there's any of that abolitionist merchandise around. We have a lot of preachers amongst us. The Methodist Church had begun to, it's split over a pro-slavery southern branch and an anti-slavery northern branch, and some of the northern Methodist ministers felt it their duty to come down here to the land of Hades, that would be us, and try to teach us better. They become very suspect, don't they? So, we're very, very much sitting on a powder keg. What's going to light us off worse is probably the Texas Troubles, or as Don Reynolds is calling the Texas Terror of summer of 1860. Some people know exactly what I'm talking about, others have forgotten it. What happened is in July of 1860, suddenly a lot of small town stores burst into flames. Here in Denton, about half of our town square was obliterated because the flames started in a small shed in the back of the store that actually contained about 25 kegs of black powder. Fire and black powder, not good mix. Blew half of Denton down. Down in Dallas, they lost their main hotel, their newspaper office, several main buildings. Dallas was probably one of the worst hits as far as dollar amounts. There were fires as far south as Waxahachie, as far east, allegedly, as Jefferson, and as far west as Decatur. There were fires in Decatur in Wise County. So, why did this happen? Well, there were folks who said, the new sulfur matches, they're unstable. Well, some of the budding scientists among us took those matches out of their boxes, walked out, laid them on the ground, stood there and watched them about 10 minutes. They didn't burst into flame. Well, that proved positive it wasn't those damn matches, right? The unit was 108. Now we know that to be true, right? It's 108 all the time in July in Texas. So that was quickly dismissed by many of our pseudoscientists who said, no, I know what it is. It's some of those guys from Kansas. It's some of those fellows that were following John Brown. They're here amongst us. It's those Methodist preachers. You know what they're trying to do? They're trying to stir up the blacks. In fact, I happen to know that they've been talking to them and offering them guns. So we had a very ugly little backlash in the summer of 1860 that was related to John Brown, related to the Kansas turmoil, and I think a lot of it has to do with that tension you live in under the fear of Indian raids. But it was directed towards blacks who were in Cook County and the surrounding counties, and those whites that might actually be supporting them. Now, as an early settler said, with no Texas Rangers around and no police, etc., we usually settled our problems with a tree and a convenient rope. And they did that in the summer of '60, too. Probably most spectacularly with a Methodist minister named Anthony Dooley, who was accused of cooperating or trying to stir up the blacks. He fled all the way to Missouri. Texans followed him there, caught him, brought him back, and hanged him over in Fort Worth. I also hanged a man named William Crawford over in Fort Worth. They hanged several blacks down in Dallas, whipped another 100 or so and released them back with an admonishment, don't try this again. I'm sure they probably, I truly believe they were walking back to wherever it was they were saying, try what again? Starting these fires. This was a step towards a major uprising. We know this for a fact. Now, newspaper editors across the state picked this up and repeated it. Absolutely, we know it for a fact. It's John Brown's ghost stalking our land. It's the same people who were up there in Kansas fighting. They're in our backyards now, folks. Now, there were people like Sam Houston, our governor, who said, oh, come on. Really? Show me evidence. Something hard. A letter. There was a letter produced, by the way, written by the Mystic Red. It's easily debunked. Very rough forgery. But Sam's voice is being lost. Why? Because people are terrified. Having lived in a pressure cooker of fear of Indian attacks, having watched Kansas explode into bloody violence, worried it would spill over into Texas, watched John Brown, they are convinced that it's now happened. It's spilled over. It's in Texas. And in that clear-minded, unemotional, absolutely level-headed frame of mind, we go into the election of 1860, where a Northern Republican candidate is elected president without the support of a single Southern state. And we know he's going to encourage more of this kind of behavior, don't we? Because our newspaper editors are telling us that. We believe our newspapers, don't we? Okay. It's the only information they have. There's no video, no BBC, no pundits. You know, the newspapers are your source of information, and they tell you this man is committed to the abolition of slavery. Absolutely, unequivocally. The only reason he doesn't have horns and a tail is they cut him off for the election and tucked the tail in his pants, right? And he knows it's it. And so if you've now got a government that's obviously fallen into the hands of a man committed to unleashing the blacks upon you, destroying your way of life, uprooting your economy, turning your entire social, economic, and political system upside down and unleashing anarchy upon you. You know, you think the summer of 1860 was bad, wait till next summer when he releases all the slaves. So what's a way to get away from this, to make this not happen? You separate your government from his government, right? Called secession. Now again, Sam Houston, the voice of reason. I'm a Sam Houston fan. We have a few in the audience, right, Mike?